apostles, it appears that they're polar opposite to who Paul is. Paul is accused, it's being held against him by the believers in Corinth that Paul is poor, whereas these super apostles are wealthy and successful. So these differences are being pulled out. While Paul is criticized by the Corinthians for having menial labor, he does it so that he's not a burden on them. Whereas these super apostles, they don't seem to understand that these super apostles are more than willing to take money from them. So we see something in the heart there, don't we? And then we've got the fact that these super apostles are eloquent speakers. Paul says he's not. And then there's the fact that Paul physically suffers for his faith. Shipwrecks, whippings, sent to prison. Whereas these super apostles seem to live a successful, outwardly blessed life in the eyes of these Corinthian believers. So, in a nutshell, the Corinthians have come to think less of Paul because they're comparing him to these false teachers. And they're embracing a different value system to the one that Paul taught them. They've come away from the teaching that Paul's given them. And their acceptance of the leaders based on status and outward appearance is nothing less, if you think about it, than a betrayal of Jesus that Paul's been teaching them. Paul highlights how, true Christian devotion isn't about making self look impressive. It's about pointing to the one that really is, Jesus. And that's exactly not what these super apostles are doing. So, intellectualism and performance-based religion is coming into the church in Corinth. Confidence in the flesh. And it's infiltrating the church in Corinth. And that's toxic to Christ's confidence. Okay? So that's crucial to understand. It's eroding the believer's devotion to glorifying Jesus. And depending on him is putting confidence in something else. So Paul isn't so much concerned that the Corinthians are rejecting him. His concern is they're rejecting Jesus, as much as they're turning away from a pure and simple devotion to Jesus as well. So how are the two situations, the one in Eden and the one in Corinth, similar? Well, you've got serpent and the super apostles. They're both upheld as servants of Satan by Paul. And in both situations, do you notice how subtle the deception is? And the goal is the same for both. It's to keep people from worshipping God in a true respect. It's to inflect eyes onto self rather than outwardly onto God. It's to bring the eyes onto the flesh. And both in Eden and in Corinth, the battle's the same essentially. It's for the minds of the believers. Okay? So if the enemy controls the minds, we're going to see, it impacts the way that we live. So what exactly is the mind that the Bible speaks about? Well, it's not the physical brain. I've spoken before about the three-part makeup of a person, and I'm going to do it again this time. If we have a look at 1 Thessalonians 5:23, it says, "May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." Okay? So, if the battle's for the mind of the believer, it's really important to understand the workings of that three-part being in order to understand the workings of the mind and bring it into devoted submission to God and keep it there. So the body's the part of me that you're looking at now. It's the physical interface with the world. It's how I experience the world through my senses. It's also the perishable part of me. So you think about it, what's happening to my body can easily influence my soul. And that's got to do with my will, my emotions, and my mind. So, I could be looking at things in the world. I could be fearful of that. That could impact my soul because the emotions are being impacted by what's going on around me or what's happening to me. Now, though we interface with with our outward appearance. So over tea and coffee later on, you'll talk to me and you'll see my outward appearance. What's actually meeting is going to be our souls. Our souls are the part of us that form relationships with others. And they have to do with our personalities. Our minds meet in the soul. So as we chat over a coffee, we're going to meet there in the soul. Then there's the innermost part of us, and it's our spirits. The spirit is the part of our being that has to do with our relationship with God. Okay, so we take an inner step, relationship with each other at the soul, in a relationship with God in the spirit. And that's the part of us that God renews as we become born-again believers. In Ezekiel 36, verse 26, God promises us new hearts and new spirit, replacing the old hardened hearts, the hearts of stone and the hearts of flesh. When we read about the heart in the Bible, we need to recognize it. It isn't a fourth part of us. It's not separate. It's not a separate part of our being. It's a composition of all three components of the soul, so the mind, the emotion, the will, plus the most important part of our spirit, which is the conscience. So it's kind of linking the two. So why is it important to highlight the heart? It's because Jesus shows us, if we have a look at Matthew 9, Jesus shows us that the heart is the part of us that thinks. So in Matthew 9, verse 4, Jesus has he's forgiven a paralyzed man and healed him, and he's addressing the teachers of the law that are sat in the room in front of him. And he kind of detects he reads what's on these teachers of the law's hearts. And he says to them, "Why do you think evil in your hearts?" The heart doesn't just think intellectually, it thinks in a deeply impacting way. So much so that Proverbs 4, verse 23 tells us, it warns us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything that you do flows from it. Reading on a few verses beyond that, 24 to 27, Proverbs 4 goes on to tell us, keep your mouth free of perversity. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thought to the paths of your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Do not turn to the right or the left. Keep your foot from evil. Ultimately, if your heart is filled with wrong thoughts, it's going to show through your words, through decisions that you make, and the direction that your life takes. Last week, Shaiju delivered some great teaching and highlighted how Moses, when he went to murder the Egyptian, he looked to the left and the right, didn't he? But he forgot to look up and, put his eyes on God. I like that one. But a wandering heart equals wandering eyes, and eventually feet wander, and the path God's calling to us deviates, doesn't it? Or we deviate from the path God's calling us on. And if you want to know the condition of your own heart right now, maybe just inwardly answer some of these little checkpoints. How faith-filled are your words when confronted with difficulty, suffering and disappointment? What's the instant thing you say in the situation? How gracious are our words in the heat of a fight or frustration, or when being criticized or let down by somebody? How easily distracted are we by things that we see and hear in the world? If we have a look at 1 Peter 3, verses 10 to 11, Peter teaches, "For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it." And just jumping a couple of verses to the start of verse 15, it says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord." So there's a responsibility for every Christian, isn't there, to check and correct themselves regularly. Learning to revere Christ and keeping him on the throne as the one that we serve. We need to guard our hearts, and that's not passive. We need to pursue guarding our hearts, don't we? We need to become single-minded. That becomes a pursuit. The active process of becoming more single-minded in our devotion to Jesus is to renew our minds. We'll come to the verse that speaks on renewing our minds in a minute, but I have a little picture to illustrate first. Now, you all know that I'm not a driver, so what I'm about to outline may not even be legal on the roads, but but let's see how we go. Imagine that the car steering in your car develops a bit of a bias and starts over several meters just drifting to the left. And it's so gradual, it's very subtle. But until you can get the car to the garage to be fixed, while you're at the wheel, you're going to need to be particularly alert. You're going to need to correct that bias, aren't you? But in order to prevent the car from drifting into hedgerow, ditches, parked traffic to the left. But once you're aware that the bias is there, you're not going to be passive, are you? You're not going to rely on your own judgment either. So you're going to be looking at the center lines in the road all the time, just as a reference point. It's going to help you stay on course. If you start to drift gradually, subtly, you're going to have that center line as a reference, and you can make a gradual, slight adjustment. And equally, those center lines, they're going to tell you if you make too much of a correction the other way. God speaks through his Spirit and through his word into our spirits, which is the spirit part of our heart, into our conscience. His Spirit and his word are like the center markings in the road. We need to keep coming back to them. We need to keep referencing them. We can't afford not to. And we need to turn the wheel of our will, emotions, and mind in line with that constantly. So, as Paul highlighted to the Corinthians, the veering away from pure and simple devotion to Jesus can be subtle. And for this reason, we can't afford just to sit back and enjoy the ride. Paul wrote to the Romans in Romans 12, verse 2. He said, "Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve the will of God, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." The world's full of advice. It's full of opinions. It's full of news. It's full of conspiracy theories, things that can sidetrack us. The flesh desires its own way all the time as well, contrary to God's way. How are we allowing these to infiltrate us and nudge us off course? Are we devoted to what God says, making regular corrections? The men in this room will possibly have seen it on WhatsApp, but the day that the Queen died, I'd been soaking in some of the news and just taking it in. And I realized that I'd started taking on some of the views that were coming at me through the media. The last constant had died in our lives. And sentiments that this was the worst time she could have died, a particularly dark time, just being compounded by this death now, this extra bad news, just to heap heaviness on us. Absolute tosh, but I'd taken it in. I'd agreed with it. And, my emotions are starting to take a downward spiral. And then walking home from work, God spoke. And he said, he's the one who remains on the throne. He's the one that remains eternally on the throne. He's the eternal constant in our lives. He's the only constant in our lives. Okay, so that's just a little example. We can start to take on thoughts of the world, and we need to be assessing what we're taking on, what we're thinking, and then hearing from God and correcting it. So in a nutshell, renewing the mind requires us to present ourselves before God regularly, and it requires us to meditate on what we hear in our spirits. Meditating from God and reading his word, bringing ourselves into agreement with him. I'd like to have a look at Matthew 5, verse 8, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." A pure heart is an undivided heart, isn't it? Now, if you take this cup of water here, it's drinkable, it sustains. Now just imagine it represents the heart. And I've got a bit of a cheesy illustration to give you, but it will just help serve a point. Let's just say you're going through your day and you get into a row with a colleague that you don't particularly like, and you're lacking in grace. You feel strife rising up into you, and that row, it just drops a little bit of strife into your heart there, see? And then you're continuing through your day, and it's a hard, busy day. You get home, and you let your guard down. Your mind is in neutral mode, and you start entertaining a lustful thought in your head. And, just as you drink that in, see, that's going into the heart there. It's polluting. It's polluting the heart. It's no longer pure. So I'm just being very careful with that, because that's green food dye, and I don't want to dye anything, except my fingers. So yes, just a little illustration there. And back in mid-18th century London, they had a serious problem with filth due to a large growth in the population going on there. And as the population grew, overcrowding happened in the streets. And the number of factories, things like slaughterhouses went up on the roadsides, cow sheds. And these things all spilt filth into the streets, which kind of trickled down. There was dung, there was blood, all sorts of gore coming out of those places, and it was all going into the sewage system, which was very primitive for the time, and it wasn't built to handle the number of people moving in. And as a result, it overspilt, and it went into the water supply, the drinking water supply. And that's what caused an outbreak of cholera over about a 20-year period in London, which killed thousands. And I just wanted to bring up that little history lesson, just as a picture of what happens. That water was defiled. And defiled is an Old English word which just means to make foul. And we find it in the Bible in relation to sin. So if we have a look at Leviticus 18, verse 24 to 28, we see God, over the previous verses, just warning Israel about the filthy practices of the inhabitants of the land they're about to go in and take. And God says, "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled." Yeah, Leviticus 18, verses 24 to 28. Oh, I see, it's on 19. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll just read it out anyway. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native-born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you. And the land became defiled, and if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. It's a graphic picture, isn't it? Defilement makes sick, and it spreads. And it makes things that were once clean unclean. Sinful living defiled the inhabitants of the Promised Land before Israel went in. And it defiled people contaminated the land itself, we read. And that land became sick and vomited them out. It rejected them. So on the other hand, we've got Israel being living in covenant relationship with God. They're being brought into the land. This is a people that God set apart. They're devoted for him, and they've been made holy. Defilement is going to require a clean-up operation. You think about oil tankers tipping over around the coast and the clean-up operation that's needed afterwards. And that's basically what God's going to do with Israel as he moves them into the promised land. Removing the source of contamination at its root. So, as such, it's vital that they avoid becoming contaminated by the same things, worshipping the false gods that the Canaanites worshipped, taking on their customs, their pagan traditions, and repeating their evil practices that are despicable to God. So when Israel crosses the Jordan and is led up against Jericho, God requires a very specific sort of devotion. And that devotion is known as herem. So herem generally refers to the setting aside of something to God for complete destruction. So if we have a look at it in Joshua 6, verse 15 to 21, you'll see what herem looks like. On the seventh day, Israel got up at daybreak and marched around Jericho, 7 times in the same manner, except on the day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and all who were with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his sanctuary." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep and donkeys. Now, going by today's world standards, that's not comfortable reading. But it's really important to see it from God's perspective here. It's really important to understand that God required Israel to be ruthless as they went into the promised land, eradicating everything that could impact their devotion and love for him. He required their hearts to be focused on him first. There were to be no spoils of war, no wives, no slaves, possessions or riches, nothing to enrich them from this in particular. There was to be no personal gain. What was to come first was obedience to him. So as a form of devotion, herem requires us to understand the holiness of God. He's a loving God, but he's also a holy God. And when it comes to sin, that's a serious business to him. God and sin, they're polar opposites. We can't serve both. And it's interesting to read how failure to obey God would bring trouble to the Israelites. Because a few weeks back when Alex was teaching, he brought a verse which really struck a chord with me, and it's been with me since. And it's 1 Peter 2, verse 11. And that reads, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." Now, apologies if you happen to like snakes, I really don't. And if I was to ever find, in the unlikely event I was to find a viper coiled up in the corner of the living room, I wouldn't just kill it, I'd obliterate it. I would make sure that thing was not going to rise up again and bite me. Okay? And it's similar, given the context of sin in the verse that we just read. It says that sin wages war against our soul. Why would you want to take that lightly? Why would you want to tolerate it, be casual with it? You wouldn't be casual with a rattlesnake, would you? So if we don't wage war on sin, it will wage war against our souls, not only bringing pain, suffering and trouble to us, but depriving God of his rightful place in the throne of our hearts. We'll live lives that are conflicted because our devotion to God is compromised. So what I'm driving at here is the need to devote the sinful attitudes, unsubmitted areas of our will, the unhealthy and unbridled emotions in our lives, in a devotion of harem to God. The pollutants in our heart that prevent us from being completely pure, completely devoted to him, they should be offered up to him in a manner that Israel offered up Jericho in devotion to God. Colossians 3 verses 5 to 10 tells us, it tells us to put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, feeling straining. So it turns out what I'd actually picked up was a repetitive strain injury. But so I kind of sheepishly left that doctor's surgery. But what I did what also struck home in my heart as I was sat there feeling foolish was actually that's an app that God had told me not to download because it took too much of my time. I'd become devoted to it. I obsessed over it. I took 20-minute toilet breaks at work to play another game, So basically, I was sinning. I'd gone against what God had told me to do. But I was looking at the pain, which was telling me something else going on. And that's the point of what I'm saying here, You'll see the pain in your life from things that you do. You'll see behaviors come out, malice, rage, slander. But what's at the root of that behavior? Target those roots. Annihilate those roots. And when we're talking about the roots that we need to target, it's every thought and emotion that defiles your heart. Actively come against it. And that includes every part of you that insists on doing things your own way. Living life to please yourself. Every lie in your heart that causes you to think that God doesn't love you, he's not enough for you. That you're not empowered by God himself to be transformed into his image. Come against those lies. Obliterate them. And how are you going to fight? Well, Israel waited for God to direct them into the promised land, firstly. And then they waited for God to take the walls of Jericho down. It wasn't in their strength. Once God had done that work, they were able to go in and then devote that city to God entirely. But it was waiting for God. So sheer willpower isn't going to do the job to overcome areas of sin in our hearts. It's not about us trying to bring down the walls of Jericho. It's not on our own. It's if that was the case, we wouldn't have needed Jesus to come and die for us, would we? Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty. So we need to operate in his Spirit. We need to be led by his Spirit against things. You know, after Jericho, Israel was led up against another place and then another place and another place. And if we have a look at Hebrews 4, verse 12, it says, "For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." Okay, so the word is going to judge the thoughts and attitudes of the heart as well. Spirit and word. So be ruthless with the flesh where you find it rising up, where you find it conflicting with the leading of God in your heart. Be diligent. 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5 tells us to be diligent. Do what Eve and those being deceived in the church of Corinth weren't doing. Demolish all arguments. So when Satan comes in with reasoning, "Oh, you've had a hard day, that's okay." No, demolish those arguments. And every pretension that sets itself up against God. Take every thought captive, making it obedient to Christ. Without the dissent of an impure heart, led by God's Spirit, we'll make strides in living pure, simple devotion to Christ. So we've come to the end of a series, and I'd just like to invite you to stand for a couple of minutes. Over the last couple of months, we've looked at many elements of what it means to be devoted, many elements of devotion to Jesus. And I'd like to end the series by giving us all a chance to respond as God's laying it on our hearts. So inwardly, would you just open your hearts up to God to hear from him? It could be, he's putting a finger on a specific point in your heart that he wants you to work with, that he wants you to really bring under his control, devote to him completely. Or it could be that once you devoted your heart to Christ, but life got busy, distractions came in, and what you need to do again is just devote your whole heart to Jesus. Or it could be that you've never devoted your heart to Jesus, and he's calling you today to do so, to invite him into your heart as Lord and Savior. You recognize that your heart is defiled, it's full of impurities, and there's nothing you can do about it to make it right with him, except turn to his Son who died for you, so that you could be forgiven. Give him your heart. I'm just going to give us a few minutes just to be hearing from God and doing business in your heart with him, and then I'll close in prayer. Lord, you've heard the words we've spoken in our hearts to you just now. Lord, would you receive those prayers, Lord, and those offerings? And Lord, as you dwell in our hearts, have the parts we've placed under your lordship today. But Lord, don't just be satisfied with that. Help us to give you more with every step that we make with you. Lord, purify our hearts. Continue to renew our minds to live lives of pure and simple devotion to you. In your name, Jesus, amen. So I'd just like to say anyone that would like to stay behind and help pack away chairs and things, you'd be welcome to do so. Otherwise, there's tea and coffee over the way there.